Hello, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are watching us from. Very welcome to everyone to this webinar on digital public infrastructure for sovereign AI. My name is Luca Belli. I'm professor here at FGV Law School, where I direct the Center for Technology and Society. And today I will be co-moderating this webinar together with my colleague Larissa Galgino Magariais, who is researcher with us at the Center for Technology and Society and also at the University of Bremen. What we will discuss today in this webinar is the importance of digital public infrastructures and how they connect with the development of AI, and particularly what we call sovereign AI. Before we start, let me just share with you our usual disclaimer. So everyone that is participating here today is participating intentionally and willfully. Nobody has been obliged, of course. Everyone is sharing his or her own personal opinion. So the statements shared today do not correspond to any official policy by FGV, but they are personal statements. And we all agree to have our image recorded and then shared on the various media platforms. So I would like to ask everyone to express their consent to this so that we can start to begin our webinar. All right. So before we start, let me introduce you our distinguished speakers for today. We have Armando Manzueta, who is Deputy Minister for Digital Affairs at the Dominican Republic government, Luanda Roncaracci, who is Deputy Secretary at the Brazilian Ministry of Management and Innovation, Lorraine Porciuncola, who is Executive Directress of the DataSphere Initiative, Mila Tenzin Sanjug, who is our researcher here at the CyberBRICS project at CTS-FGV, Camila Leice, who is the coordinator for telecommunication digital rights program at IDEC, the Brazilian Institute for Consumer Protection. And last, but of course not least, our friend, Professor Nicolas Zingales, who is professor here at FGV Law School. Now, before we start, let me share about a couple of words about why we have decided to organize this webinar today and why this debate about DPIs and AI is particularly interesting and timely in my perspective. So the two goals that we have here today is to shed light on these two quite crucial issues. So on the one hand, and we will dedicate the first segment of our webinar trying to understand what are DPIs, not only how they are defined, depending on the various setting where this concept is developed and implemented, but also how they are constructed in practice. So this is a concept that has been developed over the past 10 years, primarily led by the Indians, part of very considerable fundamental part of their digital transformation program of India, the India Stack. But then this has been migrating and expanding at the international level, driven by the UN and other international agencies, but also at the national level with a lot of very different interpretations that sometimes overlap, sometimes diverge. And so this first part of our webinar today will be indeed dedicated to understanding what do we speak about when we speak about DPIs, and then we will enter into the most relevant, the core of this webinar of today. So how can DPIs be leveraged to construct sovereign AI? And both to DPIs, especially in India and Brazil, but also to sovereign AI. These are two core issues for our research here at CTS-FGV. We have already published a very large number of publications of these, especially in the CyberBRICS project, several T20 policy briefs on DPIs this year, and also last year some policy briefs with the T20 and other publications about the overlap of cybersecurity and digital sovereignty, how actually DPI can be used to enhance digital sovereignty, so the capacity to understand, develop, and regulate digital technologies as we define it at CTS, and also create AI sovereignty, so the capacity to not only understand, develop, and regulate effectively AI systems, but also the capacity to exercise agency, self-determination, and control over such system. And what is the role that DPI play to enable these capacities? Now, we have already developed a lot of interesting research on this, but we are also in the process of publishing and developing more. So let me pass the floor for this introduction also to my colleague, Dr. Larissa Galdino Magalhães, that co-coordinates with me the research of the CyberBRICS project. Please, Larissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Good afternoon, everyone. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much on behalf of CyberBRICS program. So our discussion today is essential topic for the future of a public digital infrastructure when you think in connection of artificial intelligence, as Luca already highlighted. I hope, and I guess I'm sure actually, that our discussion today will contribute a lot to understand how we can ensure this different interests in between the stakeholders are involved now in the policy and regulation of digital public infrastructure, but also other side of stakeholders are involved in a more technical approach, which means they can be a different interesting. So how you can embrace all this and guarantee that you are focused on the human-centered technology. So thank you, Luca. Just a kind remember, if you are interested in this topic, please check in our website at CyberBRICS. You'll find a lot of discussion there. And currently, you are doing a specific research focus on artificial intelligence and DPI. So as soon as possible, you will have some news from us. Thank you so much. So let's start our discussion today. Let's start with Armando. Luca, do you want to make a first question, or you can make a first round of questions about your understanding about DPI, and after that you are moving forward with new questions, and please feel free to put in the chat your questions also. Thank you so much. You're welcome to be here.
Excellent. So before we start, also let me also remind that we are also joined by our friends from the global community of practice on digital public infrastructures, the DPI4D, which is led by our friends of the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations. This is a group of more than 25 global think tanks and academic organizations around the world that are exploring how DPI conceptions and studies can cross-fertilize each other and trying to distill some research and policy orientations to improve the debate on DPIs. So speaking about this, I think that there is no better person to start with than our friend Armando Manzueta. Armando, you have been recently appointed as a Deputy Minister for Digital Affairs at the Dominican Republic. You have been leading the Dominican Republic's digital transformation with regard to DPIs, and also you have a very prominent role as a member of the working group of the UN on DPI safeguards. So please, Armando, the floor is yours to provide a quick understanding of what DPI mean in your national, and if you can, also international experience. Please, Armando.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you all for, on behalf of my government, of the Ministry of Public Administration, whom I represent. I am more than glad to be here, to be part of this seminar, because it's a very important topic, and it's very good that we start discussing this at all levels, especially with the academia and other interested sectors. Well, DPI is a very contested topic to define because it's something that it's still very evolving. However, it is often touted as the digital rails of the 21st century. And it basically, you can define it in three ways. First, You can say it's interoperable open tech standards, protocols, and software solutions and applications that can enable access to day-to-day digital services for citizens. Basically, it's like saying you have like building blocks or Lego blocks where you can actually start building solutions, building applications, building platforms just to generate public value and to improve the quality of life of citizens through digital in one way or another. DPIs can also be defined as facilitative governance mechanisms and policies for services provision and to guarantee the current functioning of a certain government. And of course, it can also be considered a vibrant business or open ecosystem of sorts, consisting of developers and system integrators that actually generates value on top of the platforms that the government actually has. So basically, we have like that. So it's important to have a distinction because when people hear digital public infrastructure, they center on the hard infrastructure part of it. And hard infrastructure, I mean connectivity and everything that is related to the physical layer. Actually, DPIs is more into the logical aspects of it, so it's more on the software side of applications rather on the physical layer. So it's important to have that distinction because connectivity is one thing, and of course you have very important technologies because without connectivity nothing works. But it's very different from that side of things. So it's important to have that distinction as well. And also, not all software that is developed to provide services are considered DPI as well, because DPI has to have they have to meet certain criteria to be considered as such. So we can basically say that DPIs operates on pretty much 5 type of things. You have first, you have the data exchanges, the identity services, and the payment services, which are considered the foundational DPIs. However, since this definition has been evolving very fast in the past few months, actually even days, some organizations, for example, the G20 considers them to be broader than this. India has a broader definition as well. But for international standards, it consists on these 3 foundational DPIs. Although you can have more sector level oriented DPIs as well for each key each key public service that it serves. For example, education, healthcare, some financial or government intergovernment services as well. So it depending on the sector and the organization that you serve to, you can have a broader or narrower definition of it. So that's pretty much it on my side.
Thank you, Armando. So let's move forward for Luana Roncarati. Luana, just to highlight that she now leading together the government in Brazil, the digital public infrastructure focusing data. So we'll be very happy to have you here and it's an opportunity to listen about this data public infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you, Larissa. Well, it's great to be here. It's very nice to meet you. It's great to be here with Luca again and with all my colleagues. It's a great pleasure to be here discussing those topics. And wow, what I have to add here, and it was great to listen to Armando before, but wow, what I have to add, considering our Brazilian context, especially this year that we are that we have the presidency of G20, is that we followed and we agreed with the concept brought by the Indian government during their presidency of G20. And we understood that it was a very important and relevant concept, also very well related to what we've been doing in Brazil. And during our Brazilian presidency, we defended the continuation of this discussion, but also bringing the values of reliable and inclusive DPI, and also connecting it with digital government, because it's very related to what we've been doing in Brazil. And well, we understand that the use of new digital technologies and the construction of digital public infrastructure have been key to promoting more equitable access to public and private services on a social and broader scale. And this year we've been launched and published federal government, national digital government strategy with a set of strategic recommendations and also aiming at articulating and directing digital government initiatives between all federal entities. We have a very complex federal systems, and the idea of having digital public infrastructure is also very fit to this context that we have, and also with the idea of expanding and simplifying citizens' access to public services in general. On our national strategy, we brought the concept of digital public infrastructure, and we have defined it as a set of structuring solutions transversal to various public policies which adopt network technology standards built for the public interest, which allow universal scale and enable the orchestration of uses by all in an integrated manner in physical and digital channels, governed by applicable legal frameworks and enabling rules to promote development, inclusion, innovation, trust, competition, respect for human rights and individual freedoms. You can see that it's very related to the concept that we've been debating in G20, but we understood that it was important to us to have it in a national rule as well, so that we could disseminate and also increase the awareness of this concept in our national level as well. We understand that in summary, DPI can serve as a large-scale solution to systemic challenges such as social inequality, while also serving as a level for development opportunities. Well, an example that we can bring here so that we can contextualize more of what we've been doing is the combined efforts that we have on the GovBR account and the national system for citizen identification, which together provide a comprehensive solution not only for the integrated national issuance of foundational identification, but also for various features related to authentication, authorization, and signature for secure and trustworthy digital transactions. In addition, I think it's important to say that the CIN, the SIM, the new national identity card that we have, that is a reliable, secure document that we have, now have a unique national number, the taxpayer number called CPF, and now also have a unique official flow of issuance and identification data throughout the country, thus suspending the use of divergent information in citizen identification. Well, this account, our GovBR account, allows more than 162 billion citizens to access almost 5,000 digital services nowadays, provided by different government agencies. Well, in other important examples of DPIs that I could mention before I finish is the Connect-GovBR, which is a tool that integrates and shares data between government agencies and enhance administrative efficiency and improve the delivery of public services. So it's very in line with what Armando said and what the Indian presidency brought about not only identity, but also the sharing of the data sharing that we must provide and to dedicate to offer. And while we also have the PIX, the financial payment transactions that we also provide in Brazil, which is highly interoperable and changed very much the relationship between the citizen and the financial system in general in Brazil. And at last, I would like to mention also the Rural Environmental Registry, which we identify as a very important and green DPI that allows management of environmental information and rural properties and possessions, composing a database for control, monitoring, deforestation, combat, and environmental and economic planning. Currently, the registry compiles information on more than 7 million rural properties and expands its interoperability. So I would like to finish here. That's the main idea of commenting on some of our examples, and I am open to answer more questions about them if you want to. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Luana. And yes, it's very good to see that there are a very large number of concrete examples of how DPIs are already not only conceived, but concretely implemented. And I think that something that is very important that Luana mentioned, and maybe very few people know, that Brazil has almost 5,000 digital public services. So the fact of defining building blocks in the form of DPIs that help navigate this complexity of almost 5,000 different public services, digital public services. The fact of having a digital identity, for instance, is something key. It's something that can radically change how the functioning of digital public service. Also, a point that Luana mentioned that is very important, the BRICS, our digital public infrastructure for online payments. That is a very good example, and this is something that we have been stressing in several pieces of research, a very good example of how a country can reclaim digital sovereignty. Because let's not forget that before adopting BRICS, literally the only way in Brazil to process online payment was through Visa and MasterCard. That's nobody has nothing against these two companies, but these are where the monopolists or the duopolies of the digital payments. Now, this, even in terms of competition, has been extremely beneficial because they are not the only two options. That in Global South charge also between 3 and 5% of every transaction and collect and hoover all the data of the transactions, but this has been redistributed to literally dozens of financial and banking intermediaries that all use the same interoperable platform, PIX. So this is a very interesting example also of how digital public infrastructure can be very instrumental for reclaiming digital sovereignty. And in this perspective, actually, that is precisely the conception that I believe has driven the Indian efforts to build digital public infrastructures. We have the great pleasure of having with us Mila Tenzin, that has been studying this not from a legal perspective, but from a design perspective, also to understand what are the negative and positive externalities that may not be understood before the development of this form of regulation through digital public infrastructure, but that in the Indian case are very evident. Please, Mila, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be a part of this event. So I'll start by sort of present my view on the design of DPIs in India, as you mentioned, Luca. I'll start off by saying that Indian conditions are relatively unique in the world. It's a huge country, but more than that, we've had a very powerful software industry that's been developing since the 1980s, and it's one of the most important sectors of our economy. It has a robust funding ecosystem and a huge amount of engineering talent. And those are sort of like relatively unique to India's situation. We've also had a government that has had sort of unimpeded power to work towards its goals, both because it enjoyed an enormous popular mandate for 2 terms, but also because it's been sort of willing to use all sorts of methods. And so those are sort of 2 key conditions that that explains kind of the shape or the architecture of India's DPI today. And so what is that architecture? I'll focus on kind of two key features, right? Which is sort of mandatoriness and openness, and sort of how those can explain the shape of DPI in India today. Schematically, we can think of DPI's institutional architecture in India as systems that were imagined and built by the private sector, financed and promoted by the state, often with an element of coercion, which resulted in adoption by citizens, and then made open for use by the market. So that's a sort of that's a coalition between the state and the software industry that hasn't always included citizens as much as it could have. To return to the question of sort of mandatoriness and openness within that setup, I'll sort of talk about the Aadhaar project, which I'm sure, having sort of worked on DPI, everyone here is more or less familiar with. Aadhaar is India's biometric identity project, which is the foundation of DPI. It was introduced in 2009, and it was the brainchild of Nandan Nilekani, so one of the pioneers of the Indian software industry. And Aadhaar sort of was made mandatory to access government welfare, which over 60% of India's population depends on. And so that's kind of a state-enforced mandatoriness that immediately led to massive adoption in Aadhaar. In order to sort of get their welfare, people adopted Aadhaar immediately. But what happens when sort of it doesn't work, or when Aadhaar fails, and how do we deal with mandatoriness there? In India, we've actually seen fairly high failure rates in some places for Aadhaar, especially because it's a fingerprint-based technology mostly, when fingerprint readers don't recognize, say, working-class folks whose fingerprints have been erased by manual labor. And in India, we have a right to food, and sort of, in some cases, that has sort of led to people not losing access to their sort of constitutionally protected welfare. And at its worst, there have been sort of documented deaths from hunger that are tied to denial of welfare because of Aadhaar failure. So that's kind of, that's mandatoriness has both driven adoption, which is the tremendous success of Indian DPI, but it's also kind of, when it fails, it's resulted in sort of denial of rights and exclusion. And then the other one is sort of openness or open ecosystems. I think there's also some confusion when DPIs are described as open, whether it means open source or open ecosystems. And I think generally we should be thinking of them as open ecosystems, which is to say that the data and operations enabled by DPIs are made open to external actors to access. So Aadhaar, for example, can be used by banks and financial institutions to do customer verification. That's led to a massive reduction in cost to banks to open new bank accounts. And here sort of the DPI is meant to both create new markets for the private sector while improving the livelihoods of the poor by giving them access to credit. So within the system, it's projected as a sort of win-win-win situation. Cost savings for the state, new markets for the private sector, and socioeconomic development for citizens. And while it's debatable on all three fronts, I think we can sort of see DPI as increasing the sovereignty of the state and the market. If the end goal is to increase the autonomy and self-determination of citizens, then the picture is more debatable and contested. And I think sort of we have to sort of specifically pay attention to that when when DPI is being exported. And this outcome is not a necessary feature of DPI. Again, it emerges from the choices of sort of mandatoriness and openness, which elevate the interests of the state and the software industry. Mandatoriness is driving adoption, but its flip side is denial of rights. And openness has been relatively successful in India because we had an existing software industry to take advantage of these systems. It's not clear that that would be the case elsewhere also. So as DPI being built elsewhere, I hope sort of there's things to learn both from what India has done successfully and also where we've had a more mixed record. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila. So now you're moving forward for Lohane, for Simca, for that spare. But before moving, just to share some comment, because I have been reading a very interesting paper about how we can improve DPIs with a sandbox. So let's see what your advice or experience and what your ideas, how you can improve this sandbox, previous the implementation of the sandbox and bringing interoperability, new stakeholders, other stakeholders, and also guaranteed that this arrangement you put DPI together the interesting of the citizens. So moving forward, the floor is yours. Lohane, feel free to tell us about your ideas of DPI, and thank you.
Thank you so much. So after the very nice definitions from Armando and the examples from Brazil and India, I wanted to take a step back and look at it from a broader perspective. Maybe allow me to be a bit literary here. I'm going to share one of my favorite quotes from Gabriel Garcia Marquez. He says in the very first, in the very start of 100 Years of Solitude, the world was so recent that many things lack names, and that in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point. And I have two thoughts when I think about that quote. One, that sometimes we miss the words and the vocabulary for describing the world. And that is a problem because it hinders our communication. This also talks about the power of words and expressions when they are created, right? And how the world is before they are created. And when DPIs was defined in greater precision in the context of the G20 presidency, something happened, right? It was a process that was for a long time being developed and gestated in the Indian context, but the Indian presidency used that process in a very strategic way to shape an agenda internationally. And that took root at the international system. It was defined in the UNDP report. And since then, kind of a world woke up of experts and people talking about DPI as a thing, although we all know that those building blocks and somehow those systems existed before. But there was a power of creating and shaping this concept. And since then, the genie has come out of the box, as we were hearing from all of the different countries and experts, the concept continues to evolve, right? And there's so many different definitions and different use cases in terms of how that's being experienced in reality in countries. And I think what I can add to this conversation is that this is an approach that carries a stamp of the global South in it, which is shaping the international agenda. And it does carry some weight that I see in geopolitical dynamics as well. The configuration of the Troika in the G20 with the Indian presidency, then the Brazilian presidency, and then the South African presidency is a very powerful one. And so that means that you can continue and build on this definition, this community of practice that is emerging in a very powerful way. And that's very interesting. It is an opportunity for the global South. The next presidency is the US after the South African presidency. The priorities are not going to be the same. So using this and leveraging that definition, I think it was strategic not only from the South African presidency, but for the Brazilian one to actually take it and leverage it and say, we're going to run with it and put our own DNA in it and take a look into our own experiences. And the expectation is also that the African presidency of the G20 will continue that. And I do think that's very powerful. There are conversations around DPI now taking place in Europe, taking place in the US. So that's very powerful in terms of how that conversation is shaping conversations in the global North as well. And between a model that usually forces us to choose between the EU model of governance or technology, the American model, being very laissez-faire to the Chinese model, I see that with the emergence of a DPI model in the global South that I do think has a lot of potential in it as well. But at the same time, this narrative around DPI has taken so much root that we see the narrative around DPI is also being somewhat leveraged. I could also say co-opted by the private sector in a way. So we see that cloud companies are saying that they are so supportive of DPIs that they can provide DPIs, right? Cloud being that key infrastructure for so many DPIs, or also that a lot of commercial actors, big ones, can provide expertise on cybersecurity or on fraud detection to ensure security of DPIs. I'm not saying this is bad or this is good, but certainly is interesting to see a trend of if we cannot fight them, we will join them kind of approach. And what I'll say is that at the end, there's a power of this 3-letter acronym that has been pretty substantial. And I do think that we are only in the beginning of seeing how this will continue, and this concept will continue to shape our worlds and the international agenda going forward.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lorraine, for bringing a little bit more of complexity into our debate. And let us understand not only how this concept has been moving geographically, but also how, as frequently happens with concepts begin being hype and very well known, or at least very widespreadly used by stakeholders in digital ecosystem, then you immediately have a lot of stakeholders that try to appropriate them and use them to brand what they are doing in the product or service they are selling. And actually, this is a very interesting point, because it will allow us to build a little bit more of complexity in the second segment of our webinar, when we will speak about the relationship between DPIs and AI, especially with regard to cloud services. But before getting into that, let me give the floor to our friend Camilla Leite, who is also a co-author with myself and Larissa of our T20 policy brief on a consumer-centric approach to DPIs. So please, Camilla, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Luca. Thank you for the invitation. And actually, you gave a spoiler on my main point in here, that since my colleagues mentioned several definitions and several principles that are important when we are creating, developing, and implementing DPI, I will focus on a concept that we brought in this T20 paper that was written by IDEC, by CTS, and also by Consumers International. And it is the consumer-centric approach on DPI. And Luca mentioned in the beginning that we have several international discussions and several definitions of DPI, and we can see more overlaps than contradictions between them. And one of these overlaps is the human-centric approach on DPI. While this seems interesting and very deep, it's actually difficult to put this in practice, like what human-centric means. So we bring one complementary concept to the human-centric approach, which is the consumer-centric approach on DPI. And we consider that this has to be implemented since the design of DPIs. I would try to sum up this concept with 4 main principles, and considering all the aspects that we have on DPI, including the leveraging opportunities, protecting and promoting rights, but we have to do this while focusing on people and while focusing on the different aspects of people. So focusing on the consumer side, we have 4 main principles. The first one would be to guarantee equal access and literacy. Okay, this seems basics to the creation of all DPIs. The second thing would be the consumer-centric approach by design, considering that DPIs have to be publicly managed and considering the imbalances between citizens, consumers, and also the companies or the state on how these DPIs are implemented. So this is complementary to the point that was brought by Lorraine. The point is that we have to consider that there are imbalances and we have to protect people in relation to that. The third point, and I believe this is very important and challenging, would be the liability side and the complementary side of that, which is the redressal. And this point is very challenging to put in practice, and I will ask excuse for you to read on how we contribute to this inside the C20 discussions on how to promote redressal on DPI. We should secure grievance and redress mechanisms, access to legal aid, social participation, and institutional trust through capacity and independent judicial oversight, empowering people to seek redress when their human rights are not upheld or public resources are misused within the DPI lifecycle. Since we are talking about AI, one aspect that we can discuss on redressal and contesting decisions, for example, would be the Brazilian financial support, Auxílio Emergencial, for example, how people could contest the decisions related to Auxílio Emergencial. So contesting decisions automatically made, for example, by DPI, and also redressal when there are frauds on the financial DPI. Luana mentioned the PIX system, the Brazilian financial system, for example. So I mentioned the promoting access and literacy, consumer-centric approach by design with public interest and considering imbalances, the redressal side, and the fourth and most important one is the participation. Mila mentioned how DPI was developed in India with a coalition or a collusion between the private sector and the government. And in Brazil, I believe that we are going through a better road in this sense, with more public participation, and we expect this to continue and to have even more of that. Because if we are directing DPI with a human-centric approach, how can we do that if people are not part of that by design? One example that I can bring to you as well is the Forum PICS, which is the council that supports the functioning of the PIC system before the central bank in Brazil. IDEC is part of that. It's the only consumer organization that is part of that, and it's one of the few examples in the world of participation. So Brazil can be an example on promoting participation, and we expect to continue doing that. We talk about digital transformation that has to leave no one behind. We talk about DPI for the benefit of society, but we cannot focus on people and their different aspects. And especially when we are talking about financial DPI, relations to the market, we have to see the consumer side and the imbalances of that with participations on all sides. Thank you.
Thank you, Camila. So I'm calling now Nicole Zingales, our last speaker. Very happy to have your contribution here. I'm happy because I'm participating in some policy briefing with Nicole. Nicole having prepared, I guess, 3 of amazing policy brief about the DPIs. So let's listen from here, from him now about the DPI, and mainly to see the main concepts and his approach about the PICS and knowledge that he know during this panel. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you very much, Larissa. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to share some of the insights of this research. As you mentioned, in fact, I'm going to focus on 2 policy briefs that we published with T20. But I will also try to respond to questions. So what is DPI? What are the characteristics? And I think we should start from the conception that DPIs are the equivalent of railways and roads and physical infrastructures that were necessary to have our society prosper. So reflecting the fact that we live now in a digital world, now these infrastructures are no longer just physical. And in fact, I think this already goes into the problematization of the concept of DPI. I think we can say that the notion of infrastructure is probably the one element that is more uncontroversial between the 3. Infrastructure is something that can be put to use for downstream use by other parties in society, and it can be used also, I think it's an important element, in a non-rivalrous manner. So at the same time, many people can enjoy the use of this infrastructure. Now, the digital part is, I think, more controversial nowadays, because if we focus just on digital public infrastructure, forgetting about the physical element, I think we run into some of the problems that perhaps Lorraine was already mentioning as a by way of provocation, which is, I mean, you cannot forget that in order to be entirely sovereign, you must rely also on a physical connection, and a connection between the digital and the physical world. So that's first aspect of DPI that should be taken into account. About the publicness, also there is a lot of controversy, because many of these initiatives are not entirely public. They indeed are a result of public-private partnerships. And so what is key in order to ensure that these DPIs are DPIs for good is that we have a good governance system that ensures that the DPIs are truly interoperable, they enable innovation from multiple agents, and that they are, as Camila will say, consumer-facing, consumer-oriented. So with that, they should be aiming to achieve both digital and non-digital human rights, And at the same time, also, they can be an important means to achieve the SDG targets. So on this basis, in the paper that we published with Larissa, Bruna Cataldo, as Smriti Parshira, we provided 5 recommendations for a DPI for good. First of all, it is important to understand what the goals are behind the creation of the DPI. Is it about promoting inclusion? For instance, that was one of the big drivers with regard to the financial APIs. Is it about competition? Is it about some other public policy that wants to be pursued with this particular measure? So I think we should have that clear from the outset. And also we should have a metric to evaluate whether a DPI essentially has served this purpose effectively. So that's the first recommendation. The second is that they should be accompanied, when they're created, by a careful assessment of the competitive effects of these DPIs in the market. Because if we look, for instance, at UPI, but also PICS, they have a tremendous disruptive impact in the market. At the same time, they direct innovation towards one type of payment arrangement, which is the one boosted by the government. And this can be highly beneficial from certain point of view. From other points of view, it can be questioned the extent to which the effects that we have from the regulator or the public entity also being an operator of the system, are aligned with other public values and other dimensions of competition that we might want to encourage. So this also has something to do with the business model. Luca was mentioning there is a lot of data collection that is involved with the operation of these payment systems. So the fact that you have one entity that has privileged access to this data can also create some incentive for business model that might not be the one that wanted to be encouraged by policymakers when they designed the DPI in the first place. Third recommendation that we had in the policy brief is that we need to have a collaborative governance framework. So this goes in the direction of what Camilla was mentioning with the BRICS forum. So you need to have a participation by various players. And this includes not only the companies and the industry that is affected by the DPI in a more direct way, but it should involve also consumer and third parties that have a stake in the operation of the DPI more generally. Fourth, it has to do with education of consumers and businesses that needs to be done by who is creating the DPI. So you cannot just create the API and release it and forget. You need to do some outreach. You need to have a channel for communication with consumers who might encounter some problem in the operation of the DPI. So that's a very important element that, for instance, the central bank in Brazil put a lot of effort on when they created the PICS. And fifth element is, again, going back to the governance aspect. We should design a structure for accountability and governance of the DPI that makes sure that we address problems, important issues in a way that is evidence-based and that is inclusive. For instance, this goes into the issue of how you set the standards for security and privacy over the ecosystem. And this relates to the second policy brief that we published. In this case, it was co-authored with Jyoti Pandey and Manu Misra, where we raised the possible tension and issues of interaction between DPI and what is called critical information infrastructures, which is a term used in security governance to designate some crucial infrastructure within a country and applying special rules that ensure more monitoring of this ecosystem and sanctions that are higher for possible violations of security. So here, what we notice is that the UPI, for instance, was designated as a critical information infrastructure only few years after it had been created. And this, we argued, created some breaches, some inconsistencies in the way in which the infrastructure was operated in the first years. And as a result of this, we argued that in the future, and perhaps also in the G20, there should be more effort to develop common elements on what constitutes critical information infrastructure, so that there is more predictability ex ante, and also that the designations of critical information infrastructure should occur before, at the start of the operation of the DPI, and not down the road at some point, because that could create tensions with stakeholders that were adversely affected by these DPIs. So just as a final point, I would say that the most important element that should be discussed is what it takes to ensure that digital public infrastructure are really public. We're not just talking about ownership, or we are not talking at all about ownership. I think what is important is that these DPIs create public value, and that they are governed in a way that is public-facing and democratic, so that we can ensure that it does not go off the rails. So thank you very much. I leave it for now.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And also let me remind to those who are following us and watching this video that we have also the possibility to add questions. Some of you are already including questions in Slido, which is linked in the description of this webinar on YouTube. So if you have any question, please feel free to write them down, and we will deal with them when we will have the Q&A in more or less 30 minutes. Before the Q&A, let's get into the core of today's webinar, which is what is the relationship or could be the relationship between DPIs and AI, and to what extent digital public infrastructure can have an impact and help construct sovereign AI, or what are the risks if we want to see this on the other perspective, as Lorraine was already starting mentioning, and also as Nicola was stressing very well, we really need to be careful with terms and with terminology. The P of DPI, public, may have very different interpretations. Can be public because everyone can access it, but is provided by a private entity, or can be public because it is provided also by a private entity, which is a different level of accountability. So we have seen, for instance, that very similar DPIs, the UPI in India and the PICS in Brazil, they are provided by two very different types of entity, a non-for-profit corporation in India and a public entity in Brazil. So it means that if you file, for instance, a freedom of access to information to the Brazilian central bank, they will have an obligation to reply to you. If you file the same freedom of access to information request to the India, the National Corporation or National Payment Corporation of India, this non-for-profit corporation of India, they will not have an obligation to reply to you because they are not a public institution. So the conception of public is very different. But this also means that a public entity, like the Brazilian Central Bank, becomes a provider of a service which is exactly in the mandate of the Brazilian Central Bank, which is also creates more complexity, which is wonderful for us academics because we can make more papers and policy briefs, but again, brings more complexity into the debate. And also it's very important to understand which kind of infrastructure is supporting this software infrastructure. Is it a public infrastructure that supports them, or are they at the end relying on on private infrastructure that allows them to work? So these are all a set of questions that we hope to reply, or at least scratch the surface of the answer in the next half an hour. So first, let's start with our good friend Armando. Armando, so what do you see in your perspective as the relationship between AI and DPIs?
Well, it's a very interesting question, actually, because first of all, we need to identify in which case AI should be helpful, because not because the technology is being developed or it's something new, it should be integrated into everything. But in one way or another, when it comes to DPI, we have to consider that as the demand for infrastructure grows, so do the challenges. For example, you can have very powerful systems such as PICs for handling payments at a fast velocity and a large amount of people, but it is bound to struggle under the weight of the ever-increasing data and complexity when it comes managing hundreds of millions of users at the same time. So basically, you have a very sophisticated engine that is running at very high capacity, but with the ability to foresee any kind of issues, adapt to new demands, or optimize its performance in real time. So basically, the moment that we can start thinking about AI within a DPI context is when we have when we're in the moment of scaling the service delivery, when we want to increase the delivery of that service to a large amount of people across multiple regions within a very complex regional setting. When it also comes with when you have a very complex need of decision making, when that requires moderate create difficulty, context variability, and accuracy needs like recording or regulatory compliance, or when you try to define a redress mechanism, for example, which is something that that you guys are trying to do with PICs. Also, when you have a lot of automation of repetitive, low context tasks, when there is a need to automate highly repetitive tasks that requires high accuracy and low context variability, and of course, this comes very tight with some very deep interoperability requirements, because you need to consult a lot of data between several systems that needs to be exchanged at the same time. And of course, when you want to reduce, when you make some sort of some scale economy or reduce efficiency, or increase efficiency by reducing costs. And of course, when you're trying to personalize user interaction, which is something that is very pervasive these days, especially when you have a large, when you have to gather a large use base that has different needs that come from different social contexts, it is important to see how you can integrate AI into this. So this is why the discussion has been while trying to implement these technologies within a DPI context. Because there are some requirements that definitely should be taken into consideration moving forward, because there are many things that overlap within these two, especially when it comes to data governance. You need to have a unified data governance that runs throughout all the AI technologies, especially the models that you're using to train and to run these kind of interactions that you're trying to put within the DPI ecosystem. You need to have the proper technical infrastructure, and that means the computing power required to do so. And of course, it should be done in a way that doesn't hinder that doesn't affect the financial scalability of the systems, but also you also have to take into consideration in how you can implement this in a way that doesn't affect the sovereignty of the data, the sovereignty of the systems, the sovereignty of the infrastructure as a whole. Of course, and of course, there's something that should be taken into consideration, which is the security, ethical, and inclusive design aspects of it. Because if it's not designed with these elements in mind, you basically are running the risk of leaving out a large part of the population, excluding minority language speakers, for example. You're running the possibilities of increasing certain cognitive bias regarding a certain specific population, and it's something that basically that only can exacerbate the digital divides. And of course, you can defeat the main purpose of trying to implement DPI at scale, which is to provide better services to increase the quality of life of people. So basically, these are my 2 cents on this point.
Thank you, Armando. Continues our panel, moving forward to Luana. I just increase a bit our question about DPI and I, because I want to use this time also to discussion a bit what the Brazilian government has doing once you are in the front of this initiative. We know that Brazilian government just launched recently the IA para o bem de todos, and one of those aspects there and goals that the government has been target is creating the data public infrastructure, which means some standards and structure and rules and the governance to support the flow of data through these different entities at the government. And I just would like to know if it's match the idea to improve AI through the public service in Brazil and also the DPI. Once you already highlighted in your first mention that also the government created recently some recommendations through the national digital strategy. How you can combine all of this and in the long term data, the more structural approach of data is in the front of the government. What do you think about that and can share about that? Thank you, Luana.
Arisa, thank you very much for this introduction. You already mentioned some of the key components that I am about also to share with you a little bit. In Brazil, we understand that it is crucial for us to seize the opportunities brought by the AI, but we also understand that we need to do that in a very strategic way, tailoring the technologies to our context, to our social, economic, environmental, and cultural context, and leveraging our rich and diverse data ecosystems. So, as you mentioned, we recently mobilized in our national level, in our federal government, we mobilized an effort to launch the Brazilian Artificial Intelligence Plan that's for Science and Technological Council. And the name of the plan is AI for the Good of All. And the plan brings the proposal of allocating resources for research, training people, encouraging companies, and also indicating the need to regulate the technologies, and also the need for computing process, computer capacities, and also the idea of using AI for public services to improve public services in general. We understand that the AI can help fostering transparency, more responsive services in general, to be more proactive. So the idea is also that we have an axis related to improving public services, but also the plan aims to engage national IT enterprises, GovTech businesses, and many relevant stakeholders to build a resilient AI infrastructure aligned with Brazil's strategic interests and public values. As I previously mentioned, we have the axis related to improving public services, and we established the creation of a center for governmental artificial intelligence. And the main goal is to coordinate a set of actions and to provide infrastructure, to provide platforms that could promote the use of AI applied to public sectors in general, taking advantage of all the potential and synergies between different governmental institutions. We know that AI has been used by many different organizations in public sectors, but also we know that we have a tendency of failure, of general failure of AI projects. It's not easy that all of them will actually finish their life cycle, I mean. And we know that from some numbers from Ghana, for example, that at least 50% of the AI projects tend to fail, and it's not only in the governmental sector. So the idea is that we can provide some infrastructure, some maturity, and to help the organizations to have more maturity to deal with data and also to apply artificial intelligence, and mainly in a very responsible and ethical manner. Well, the idea, the plan, and also all the rules that we've been working this year brings the idea, the concept of national data infrastructure that we call IND, Infraestrutura Nacional de Dados, that include a series of initiatives and is related to creating a robust public data ecosystem, including the concept also of sovereign cloud, so that we can guarantee national operational autonomy, the integrity and security of information, and the privacy of our citizens, and the compliance to our LGPD, which is the GDPR that we have in our national context. So END proposes concepts, regulations, and essentially technological tools necessary to improve the strategic use of data controlled by public sector, and also will serve as the basis for our AI as well, especially in the public sector. And the main purpose is to improve our maturity and capacity to strategic use and reuse of data for public interest. Data localization policies also ensure that data generated within national borders is stored and processed locally, enhance data sovereignty and security. It's also a concept that is important that we have been working with in the context of the AI plan and also the IND. And while we understand that all this infrastructure will serve as a foundation upon which AI technologies can be developed and deployed effectively and responsibly, especially. Also, as Armando mentioned, we understand that it is very important that we promote data governance and the strategic use of data. And we've been working on a proposal so that we will briefly publish a data government policy for federal bodies and entities. And also we are promoting a lot the adoption of the program Conecta-Gov that fostered the interoperability between different databases in Brazil. I think it's also important to mention that Brazil is well positioned related to Latin America when we consider the possibility of data centers in general. We are also very well positioned related to sustainability, because we understand it's very important to say that we have a green and renewable energy matrix, so that it's important to support all the infrastructure that AI brings and needs. And while I think to finish, I would like to conclude, I would like to mention that we understand also that international collaboration can play a very important role in advancing sovereign AI and to foster and to help us to think about DPIs related to AI, and it can help strengthening the state capacities in general, especially in developing countries, and we understand that we can benefit from these strategic partners in general, and especially when we consider also the cooperation between government, academia, private sector, so that we can think about innovative AI, but also ethical solutions that can help reduce bias and be very responsible with our population.
Excellent, very, very important points that Luana was stressing, and many of them resonates really a lot with the research we have been developing, especially in the context of the CyberBRICS project. The fact that policies that understand the interest of data sovereignty, AI sovereignty, should take into consideration not only the regulatory side of it, but also the infrastructure side of it, and the fact that you need to invest and create also the kind of infrastructure, not only the software infrastructure as DPIs usually are, but also the hardware infrastructure on which such software can run. And this is actually something that brings me back to Mila, because after 10 years of development of software and various types of DPIs in India, India is also massively betting on AI and also on the development of infrastructure that can compute infrastructure that can support AI. So Mila, what in your vision is the relationship between DPIs and AI, and on the other hand, also how AI can impact DPIs.
Great. Thank you so much, Luca. So here I'll share a framework that I'm developing with my colleagues, Alexandre Costa Barbosa and Amrita Sengupta at the CyberBRICS project. And broadly, we see two ways that AI and DPI relate. The first we call AI for DPI, where AI is being used to further DPI's goals. And the second is DPI for AI, where sort of DPI is being used to promote AI development. And if we use the metaphor of sort of DPI as rails, AI for DPI is where sort of AI is actually constructing the rails themselves, and DPI for AI is where sort of, some sort of AI solution might be the train that's running on the rails of DPI. So to start with AI for DPI, I'll say that AI for DPI is already ubiquitous. If we go to, and that's sort of defining AI very broadly. It depends on how you define AI. But, if you think about the example where citizens are denied welfare because their worn fingerprints aren't read by fingerprint readers, that's a decision made by an algorithm in the software of the fingerprint reader. The same would be true of DPIs that use facial recognition. There are algorithms that combine multiple large databases, such as the Cadastro Único in Brazil. You have algorithms that deduplicate entries in single databases to make sure that there aren't extra beneficiaries receiving government welfare. You have matching algorithms that decide sort of who is eligible for what benefits and so on. So those are already ubiquitous in DPI. They're generally not machine learning types of AI, but if we think about AI as sort of systems for automated decision making that produce disparate social outcomes and impacts, which sort of pose particular questions about responsibility and accountability for decisions, those are all sort of AI systems that are deeply embedded in DPI already. And there's more room for development here. For example, we might think of sort of chatbots or voice interfaces to expand public service delivery. Those would also sort of fall under what we call AI for DPI. When we're talking about AI sovereignty, we're probably more interested in DPI for AI, right? We know that AI development, especially in machine learning, requires large amounts of data and compute. And access to data and compute is obviously unequally distributed around the world right now. And so I'll talk about sort of two proposals for DPI systems to actually provide that data and compute in India, with the goal of sort of rectifying structural inequalities in access. These are both systems that haven't achieved wide adoption, but they're proposals to sort of apply the DPI model that I described in the last, in my last response to the problems of AI. So in India, we have 26 official languages and hundreds of non-official languages, each with their own scripts, and in some cases, they have over 100 million speakers. And that's been identified as a site for collection of linguistic data and the development of vernacular language models. So we have a Bhasha Dan project, which is a public-private initiative that crowdsources language inputs from diverse Indian languages from citizens to create a sort of repository of data in multiple languages. These languages in turn, these data sets in turn are sort of opened to train AI models for use by different stakeholders. On the compute front, we have an open cloud compute system that's been proposed by a group called People Plus AI, which is spearheaded again by Nandan Nilekani, who founded Aadhaar. And so here, rather than trying to compete with large US cloud services by building large data centers, it aims to aggregate lots of micro cloud providers to pool their resources and then to sort of open access to market actors. So here, the promise of open cloud compute is that sort of small businesses and developers can discover new compute resources. Instead of going to Microsoft Cloud or Amazon AWS, developers building an app could go to OCC and sort of directly transact with small-scale cloud providers. That's sort of addressing like a discovery problem, rather than an actual problem of resources at scale. So that's not going to let companies build large models like GPT. which Microsoft is building nuclear reactors to power, but it will sort of allow and enable small-scale development, which is great if it works. The question of scale kind of brings me to the limits of DPI for AI as imagined within the Indian model. I sort of made the point earlier that the software industry has been central to how DPI has been imagined in India. And the flip side is that India hasn't historically had much of a hardware or manufacturing industry, although that's changing. But, I wonder if DPI for AI is sort of a software solution to a fundamentally hardware problem that's addressing software bottlenecks, but can't really address problems of sort of hardware capacity that are central to AI sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you, Mila. So moving forward with Lorraine, I had already introduced a bit the idea of sandbox in the beginning, but I do overlap now just to ask you how you can draw on the idea of DPI, sandbox, and AI. If you can bring these three labels together. So much chances to hear from you and learning from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're not making it easy for me, but I'll give it my best. So in a few ways, how DPI can support an AI, and I'm gonna echo in a way some of the points that were already mentioned. DPI can provide those building blocks for data governance, right? Storage, sharing, all of which are foundational for AI systems. DPI can enable data interoperability, portability, accessibility, which are key for countries to develop an AI that fosters digital self-determination. DPI can foster secure and interoperable systems that can be used for identity verification and fraud detection, including in AI systems. And typically the building blocks for DPIs involve frameworks for interoperability, right, across sectors and stakeholders. And if those are in place, they could certainly increase interoperability and efficiency of data for AI systems. On the other hand, flipping it, AI can also support DPI in several ways, as it was mentioned in amazing examples by Mila. AI can enhance automation efficiency of DPIs by analyzing large data sets within DPIs to provide insights and decision support for policymakers. AI can play a critical role in safeguarding DPI as well, particularly in areas like cybersecurity, in terms of detecting that kind of fraud and threats and automatically responding to mitigate risks. But conversely, also AI can also make fraudsters much more efficient, including within DPIs. And I think that should be mentioned as well. DPI and AI carry then together enormous potential when paired, one way or the other, but also, in my opinion, common challenges. And for me, the key question there here is trust. How do we ensure that trust is built within those systems, within AI and within DPI as well? And how do we ensure that, as Camila mentioned previously, that we put humans at the center of all of that, right? How do we translate a high-level objective of multi-stakeholder participation and integrate it into the system by design, either DPI or AI? And the paper that we're developing, which Larissa mentioned earlier, discusses some of these challenges and looks into how sandboxes could contribute to this. A quick definition: sandboxes are safe spaces to test new technologies and practices against regulatory frameworks, or to experiment with innovative uses and means of governing data. So those are regulatory or operational sandboxes in the way that we define it. And so why sandboxes can address this question of trust, you ask, and think about the prisoner's dilemma, right? And how the incentives are there when you have one player playing against the other. The incentives are there for you to cheat or try to get the best advantage for you in that. And typically the result when the game is played once is that everyone is left worse off, right? Particularly if one cooperates and the other one cheats. How the game changes is that, and there's a lot of studies on that in terms of it's how when you play the game over and over again, you start mimicking the other's behavior, you start understanding who you're playing with, and you start creating trust. And sandboxes is all about the bidirectional learning. You have in the context of regulatory sandboxes, regulators learning from the private sector in terms of what they're trying to do, and the private sector understanding what's the goal of that policy or that regulation to begin with, and they learn with each other. And so originally the context, the concept of sandboxes was developed in the fintech, and sandboxes have proven their utility and are now being applied across different economic sectors, including transportation, telecom, and artificial intelligence. And what we are looking to this paper is looking at how these sandboxes can also be applied within DPI. In the case of Brazil, sandboxes have already been used for PIX. PIX is a result of a sandbox within the central bank, right? And so we're looking to a taxonomy and trying to look into 3 dimensions of how sandboxes could help mitigate the risks of DPI. And very shortly, because I know I don't have that much time, we'll look into how sandboxes can mitigate risks in the technical dimension in terms of providing a controlled environment to prototype for testing new technologies and testing scalability of DPI solutions before they are fully deployed at scale, and also to help identify potential risks and challenges early in the development phase of DPI. In the dimension of policy and governance, sandboxes can foster collaboration between governments, private sector, and civil society in terms of creating that fora for consultation in a structured way. These partnerships are essential for developing comprehensive DPIs and AI as well, in a way that continues to benefit all stakeholders in various communities at the heart of those solutions. And thirdly, within the economic dimension, and we'll look into evidence in terms of that, by involving end users and humans, right, and communities in the testing phase, sandboxes could ensure that DPI are user-friendly and meet needs of diverse populations, and also in a way that actually DPI can also be tested regarding their sustainability for improvement, and in supporting of the finance and long-term investments that are typically needed to maintain those solutions as well. So we also look in terms of some of the challenges in developing sandboxes in the context of DPI, but overall, our preliminary conclusion is that sandboxes could be the means to foster a safer collaborative space that lead to the end goal of responsible innovation and building of trust. That is where innovation that bears in mind the needs of communities and effectively provide solutions to the complex issues that policymakers and other actors are facing with DPI and also for AI.
Excellent, very good. And actually, I think we are going in the right direction, because we are understanding that on the one hand, we have first we have a need to foster multi-stakeholder cooperation, not only for the sake of saying multi-stakeholder and being sure that everyone knows that we are inclusive and participatory, but for the real need to have different needed actors cooperating for the implementation of the solution. And here, this is something that is very much evident when we speak about both DPIs and AI, because there is no single actor that can alone use, regulate, and implement them both. And then the problem is that when they are used, implemented, and regulated as it happens now, it may frequently happen that some actors have an enormous predominance and others may become mere users without having no understanding of how they are developed or regulated. And that is frequently the case of consumers. And this is where I wanted to come back to Camilla, because we have seen we've heard over the past hour and a half almost a lot of excellent principles. We have heard about the existence of legislation that regulates already some aspect of data governance, for instance. We have heard about the existence of DPIs, but then it's always good to take all this with a grain of salt and understand in practice what can be the harms for consumers, and what is the reality that consumers face when this relationship between DPIs and AI happens in practice?
Differently from the other question, when we were talking about definitions, we have several definitions. In the intersection between AI and DPI, we don't have much. We have several discussions on both of them in the same spaces. For example, the G20 has a priority digital government DPI, and as well AI. Same thing for the Pact of the Future on the Global Digital Compact. We have this also in the, several spaces, but the intersections we don't have. Actually, I was to prepare myself for this presentation on the Global Digital Compact inside the digital goods and the digital public infrastructure main part. They mention AI. The development, the dissemination, and the maintenance through multi-stakeholder cooperation, safe and secure open source software, open data, open artificial intelligence models, and open standards that benefit society as a whole to promote DPI and digital public goods. So this is the only mention that I've saw internationally. CTS is exploring these potentialities much more. So I see a lack of on how specifically AI can or cannot be used. The fact is that AI is a fact. We are not challenging whether this exists or not. We are assessing on how and when can we use it. So we use the same principles that are used in the first part of the consumer-centric approach on DPI to see a consumer-centric approach on the intersection between AI and DPI, and I answer directly your question, Luca, on the harms of that, and also the potentialities. We also have to see the potentialities. First, when we are talking about literacy, one example that is important, for example, is the use of chatbots that people cannot interact. When we are thinking about elderly people interacting with automated chatbots, this can be an issue. So we have to consider how can everyone have access to that. While this can increase efficiency, this is one side and it's important, but we have to think how can everyone be included on that. So first thing, in terms of literacy, chatbots might be one point of attention. Second principle that I mentioned, the consumer-centric approach by design. When we are thinking about the use of AI in DPI, we have to focus on solutions and on the public interest. We don't have to use AI for everything. We can use different kinds of technology. For example, one thing that we mentioned is the fraud prevention on peak systems. This considers the problem of society and use AI to save and to solve this problem. This is an important and efficient use of AI. But this has to be promoted for the public interest. And for example, when government data is being shared with private parties without people understanding the terms of this data sharing, this might be harmful. So, and also, for example, to understand credit scoring with private bureaus, we have to address how this can be discriminatory to consumers, to citizens. The third principle is redressal. We have the example of PIX. I mentioned the example of the Brazilian financial support mechanism that can be discriminatory if it's automated decision. But DPI can use these learnings, the DPI development can use these learnings to retroalimentate the creation of DPIs. So using from past concerns, past examples to not make these problems again. Especially when I'm talking about the financial support, the Brazilian auxílio emergencial. Considering the participation, when we are talking about AI, we are talking about several possible concerns related to discrimination and bias. So it doubles the importance of people participating and different people participating. It's not organized civil society that must participate on this. For example, we see even memes online of people not being able to access gov.br because they cannot do the facial recognition because they're Black people, and maybe they don't have sufficient database of on how to access being a Black person. So we have to solve these discrimination problems. Otherwise, people don't have equal access. And to end, I believe that one important thing as well is what Luana mentioned about the context. When we're talking about AI, we have to consider that a global south, a global majority country might be dependent on technology. So that's why I believe this webinar is framed correctly. We are talking about sovereign AI. So what solutions can we think? And this has to come together not only with the promotion of DPI, but also with a sovereign policy. I'm talking specifically about Brazil on how to promote these technologies internally as well, how to promote these capabilities internally, but also always focusing on consumers and people in the center of these technologies.
Thank you, Camila. Before moving forward with Nicolo, I just want to say thank you so much, Lorraine, to be here today. Lorraine must leave us because she have another meeting. Thank you so much, Lorraine, again. So
thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Our pleasure. So come back here, Nicolo, just to recap our question and increase a bit. We are looking for discussion, the implications between DPI and AI, and just make me do it a bit complicated to you, because I remind you for your last words that you talk a bit about business model and public value. What we can learn from the competitive thoughts, this business model, because it's something that begin bigger now in the public sector, how you should manage it when organize our data, when establish some plans or organizational strategy or something like that. But what you can expect it in this critical approach about DPI and AI. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Larissa. That's a big question. We'll try to give some reactions to that. I mean, I think that it's particularly important in an era of generative artificial intelligence that we ensure a plurality of large language models and LLMs applications, because what that is crucial to make sure that they are being put into the uses that society needs and that are in line with the objectives of public interest that we were mentioning previously, that should attach to DPI as a condition for this being DPI for good. And so I think that we should point out that this market right now is highly concentrated, and the initial reactions that was adopted by various players in the sector was, well, at least some of them initially was, yeah, let's forget about the problems because we have open source models that everybody can use and modify, and they can create their own applications. So then there shouldn't be too much restriction and concern over the development of large language models. However, the problem with that is that we have a concept of open source that traditionally was applied to software, right? And here we are in a different environment with many layers that are relevant to make sure that there is an open, a collaborative science environment. So this might be a good example, perhaps the best example of the problems of looking at DPI only with the focus on the software side, you know, because you forget a lot of the problems that are underneath. So for instance, in this market, you need, as it was already mentioned before, access to large volumes of data to train these models. So this is not something that is available to everybody. And even if you make this data available from one player to other users of these models. The use of this data will probably be coming with some strings attached, so you will need to pay for the royalties. There will be some contractual restrictions over the use of this data, so it's not entirely free. Another aspect is the computational capacity. It was also mentioned, so here we don't have many players that are in possession of the semiconductors that are required to efficiently train these models. And at the same time, one component that would allow to increase computational capacity is the use of cloud, and also cloud computing market is quite concentrated. So again, there might be some restrictions that will not enable everybody to use and develop new large language models. Finally, or at least as a third layer that is important, we need to have access to the parameters of the model. It's not sufficient to just release the architecture. So you need some collaborations from the developer side. And sometimes this also requires not just the collaboration, but the skills in terms of AI workforce that not everybody has in the market. So again, like just pointing out to the fact that a model is open to some extent is not satisfactory. So then what should be done? I think that we have seen in other jurisdictions, such as the European Union, the attempt to use the AI regulation to also incentivize open source artificial intelligence. So there are a number of exceptions in the AI Act that would relax some of the regulatory requirements for players that make the AI models available or AI components available on a free and open source basis. But again, here is not capturing all these other restrictions in the value chain that might be quite important for somebody to effectively compete with incumbents. So I'm not sure that the regulation of AI is the best place to make carve-outs that then would encourage the development of open source AI. Open source AI should be encouraged, but perhaps the most appropriate instrument to do that is through the AI strategy. And this AI strategy should have a vision for building artificial intelligence applications that are open source, should also have an eye for like making investments, using the investment and purchase power of the state to drive the adoption of these models that are truly open source and collaborative. There should be also instances where some of the components of the value chain are directly provided by the state, perhaps in partnership with the private sector. We have an example here in Brazil with the supercomputers that are built at Santos Dumont, and they have been recently being boosted by an investment made by Petrobras. So who knows? I mean, this could be one way to encourage the development of local AI, making available supercomputers that allow more complex operations by researchers. And another aspect that I think we should reflect and think about more deeply in the future is how to also build not only data infrastructures, which is quite important, so the standardization, parameterization of the data for sharing data, but at the same time also data spaces, where perhaps a developer of AI can go and tap into that and find a rich volume of data that is of quality and can be used to either build or refine existing models. So I think that there needs to be more vision on the DPI deployment for AI. And an element that I also mentioned before that I think should be included in this approach is the educational aspect. So we cannot just put the resources out there and just expect that engineers would crop up and develop thousands of applications without having some programs that enable training and development that is well suited for this kind of objective. So I think also that's connecting to the previous part. We need outreach and education to make sure that this delivers public goods. That's it on my part.
Thank you very much, Niccolo, for this. And indeed, I think that it is very important to stress for those who are watching this webinar that when we started this webinar highlighting the complexity of the terms AI, of the terms DPI, and even more when they meet. And when we speak about AI sovereignty, and this is something that we have been discussing in several publications over the past 2 years, it's really a multi-layer approach that we have to take with what I was writing last year in a paper, the AI sovereignty stack. So the fact that we have to utilize multiple enablers, and as you may say, you were saying, sorry, digital literacy is critical, data governance is critical, software, the development of software algorithms, of computational capacity, meaningful connectivity, again, something that we need also to start realizing is that all these elements are connected. And if we, even if we develop very nice data centers, but then everyone in the global south still has only access to sponsored social media through zero rating, and the majority of the population only access a very limited amount of applications. Even if you develop the best possible AI, people will not access it because it will represent a cost for the regular user to access it. That's why actually in this sense India was extremely smart, because part of the digital transformation strategy of India in 2016 was already to prohibit zero rating, to prohibit the sponsoring only of a very limited number of applications, because that of course creates an enormous imbalance and eliminates the level playing field that you would naturally have on the internet, which is at the end of the day essential to access AI, right? So with this, I would like to open the floor for questions and remarks. We have already, I'm seeing this in the Slido, we have already some that have been shared by people that are following the webinar. So the first one, what governance arrangements can be used to ensure that DPI are governed in effective and accountable fashion? Then we have one on what are existing good practices on DPI. There's a very interesting one for us on the CyberBRICS project about what do you think that the need for development of DPIs in the BRICS could reshape FDI, financial direct investment in member states. And then there was one for Lorraine, but we can open it to the rest if others want to chip in. Do you have examples of sandboxes used to experiment DPI or AI? Who wants to go first? You can either raise your hand or unmute yourself directly if there is no one else speaking. Yes, Nico.
Since I'm from FGV, I would like to leave the floor to somebody else, but if nobody wants to go, I'm happy to chip in.
As in the interest of time management, as you are already starting to speak, I suggest you continue and then you will pass the floor to someone else.
So I would take a crack at the first question, which is what kind of governance and accountability measures can be taken. So I think that this is a crucial question. First of all, as I mentioned at the beginning, a very important aspect of this is developing some KPIs, some metrics to make sure that you can then verify whether the DPI I serve this purpose. So that's one important element. Second element is participation of various facets of society that may be affected by the use of the DPI. So we can look at some of the examples in the financial sector with the creation of governance committee that would decide based on consensus over certain key aspects of the DPI. And also the forums like the PICS forum, where some of these issues can be debated more widely without having to take votes on every single aspect, but you can explore a broader set of questions. And the third element that I think is important is to recognize that very often we are in a situation of experimentation. So you need to be able to go back and figure out, what is working, what not, because you might want to change some of the key components or key characteristics of the DPI if they do not serve the public interest in the way that you were anticipating it. So it's important to have an agile also regulation that allows these adjustments over time. So I think these three, at least, we can discuss more, but in the interest of time, I'll leave it for the next question.
All right, I see Armando. Please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, well, governance can be something very tricky, and it also can be tied even to cultural aspects of each country that is implementing a DPI, a digital transformation DPI-based strategy. But basically, you can say you have different models, but it comes up to three ways, basically. First of all, you have the public sector-led approach, which is something that the government develops and puts available the digital public infrastructure to other public institutions, or through a centralized agency such as the digital agency of a ministry, or basically they delegate that to a private organization, but it's deeply linked to the public sector as a whole, so they can keep the public aspects of it open to everyone. Or you can have the private sector approach, which is basically relegate the development of DPI to the private sector organizations, and something that has happened more commonly with the payment systems across many countries, especially in Latin America, where these institutions are actually the ones that are building DPI and then defining some core aspects of its functioning, with some minimal to medium government oversight on how it operates, and to keep the level playing field competitive for other players to be part of the ecosystem. But something that has happening even before is it's more of a combined approach, where you have key government platforms that are completely owned and operated by the administration, that are open, and understanding open not necessarily as open source, but of open access, so people can leverage on those platforms and build and construct ecosystems, so they can build some even privately operated or privately owned DPI for public purpose or whatever, and then build services upon that. But there's no specific model that you can say that it's best or not, but simply as that the key aspects of each model is to have a proper stakeholders model that is actually in place, that you can have accountability and the rules in place, so you can guarantee the rights of people, and the DPI serves its purposes. At the very end of the day, this is what the government should be aiming for. But it depends on which way you would like to do. If you want a whole an end-to-end public-owned DPI ecosystem, or if you want something that is more balanced according to the interests or the capabilities of the country at the same point. Because, for example, India, like they said, they have a huge base of developers. They have a very mature software industry, and that's something that have helped them to have this to have the scale that they already have with DPIs. All the nations have other countries that doesn't have that. So, on the selecting the governance model is something that should works for you. And of course, keeping in mind the core principles that and the foundational principles that Nicola has exposed so well regarding how to do this properly.
Thank you, Armando. Please, Camila.
Thank you, Larissa. I will actually, well, since we don't have much time, I will actually show that we don't have necessarily an arrangement showing here, but the Universal DPI Safeguards Framework has at least a mapping of the actors involved. So this can give us an idea on how and which possibilities we can bring on arrangements. First thing. And second quick thing, once we are considering multi-stakeholder approach, it's important to have participation, but it's also important to consider the imbalances of participation. So I recall also the Net Mundial plus 10 principles, which are related to internet governance in general, but I believe it's important to access in here. For example, when we are promoting the participation of all the stakeholders, including the private sector, we have to consider the imbalances between the private sector and a consumer organization and a Black movement organization and several civil society organizations and people that want to be part on this arrangement since the design, but the capabilities are different. And it's the role of the government to promote an equal participation considering all these imbalances.
Yes, Mila, go ahead.
I'll jump in on this point and also kind of try to tackle the question about FDIs, which I see as a question that's particularly that we've seen play out in India because the development of DPIs has gone hand in hand with the development of a startup industry, which in India really took off after 2015, and that's been largely funded by venture capital that's come from like large North American funds, pension funds and the like. Like that's the capital flow that's playing out there, and the role that DPI is playing in that system is that it's giving startups access to markets, right? And so there's kind of one loop there, but the sort of idea of DPIs is that if you provide the infrastructure, the market will deliver the public interest, and that's not exactly clear that that's how it'll play out in the Indian situation, especially if you look at startups. Like their goal is not to maximize shareholder value; it's to show as large of a user share as possible, and then exit, right? And it's not clear that when you're talking about financial services for 900 million very poor Indians, that's the kind of business model that you want to have there, and that's sort of where the way you want money to flow through the system. So that's kind of just one set of questions that's both about investment, but also about how the state and the private sector should relate there, and to address the question of public value.
Excellent. I'd just like to stress this comment from Mila because it's quite important. Currently, that's the main discussion now in Europe related to GovTech, because most of government and Interoperability Act just try to make a viable startups deliver governmental technology, mainly in local level, but they also struggling to address some business model or more responsible business model, whatever, but something that can build the trust, but at the same time offer and take advantage of capabilities in the government. So thank you so much to be here today. I will pass the floor to Luca to say thank you for everyone. I'm very happy to be part of that. Thank you.
Just to finalize, just want to check if perhaps Luana wanted to have some final words as well, as everyone else has already given some comments. Luana, do you want to give your final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I can do this. Luca, thank you very much for this point. Well, I think it was an amazing discussion, very relevant and important points that were presented. I just would like to mention that actually to add some elements here, some other dimensions that I think there is this point on governance, and we are discussing it a lot internally and thinking about how we can advance it, and we understand how important it is and how it could be helpful to us. But we have other components that are also important that I would like to mention so that we have in this big picture, which is in some cases the need for coordination inside government, and also the possibility of bringing other actors from the subnational levels in the case of Brazil. So I think this governance is important to think in a broader aspects in general, and we are advancing with the committees related to our national strategy that I think it's important. Also, the idea of thinking about how you have the sustainability related to financing DPI, it's something that is also very important, and bring other actors and stakeholders to this. And alas, the point of the challenges that we have, considering the technological issues and things in the choices that we need to make, and there are other actors related, and also to reskill and to upskill our forces, our human resources. So I think these are the main challenges that we have that also add elements to the reflection on the governance of DPIs as a whole. I would like to end like this, just to add some things to continue the reflection.
Fantastic. And indeed, I cannot agree more. Indeed, I really believe, and that's something, again, we have been discussing in multiple research output over the past years. And besides research, development, and regulation, one really needs governance in the sense of communication, cooperation, and ideally coordination amongst all the stakeholders that are engaged into these various layers that may lead to an AI sovereignty stack, or even a DPI stack, as we have seen in the Indian case, even if we can criticize this to some extent. But we have some very interesting examples from some of the BRICS countries about this. And actually, let me close also reminding that we have, besides the publications that have already been released over the past 2 years, we have a couple of very fresh publications in this respect. We have just released a special issue on digital transformations in the BRICS, where we analyze very critically the choices and strategies of the BRICS countries, including how they leverage digital transformation for digital sovereignty. We have an upcoming book mapping the regulations on this that is upcoming in the next couple of months, and in the next couple of weeks, it should be released by the end of this month. We have our book on digital sovereignty in the BRICS that is going to be published by Cambridge University Press, and the introduction and conclusion are already available on cyberbrics.info. Also, the very last directed advertisement. Also, do not forget that in a couple of weeks, we will host the BRICS Plus Digital Competition Summit that is spearheaded by our colleague, Professor Nicolo Zingales, together with CAGI, the Brazilian Antitrust Authority, and the antitrust authorities of the BRICS Plus grouping. So you will have more news about these issues also from a competition perspective in a couple of weeks. Having said that, let me thank one more time all the participants for their stellar contributions. Very interesting debate and a lot of ideas. I hope for those who were watching us live on YouTube, but also for those who will watch the video or who will have interest in engaging more with our research. Very happy to be here as a moderator today. Thank you a lot to our Indian friends from the Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, the CREAR, and the Global Community of Practice on DPIs, the DPI for the community. Thank you very much for everyone. See you at the next webinar. Ciao, ciao.